So, and you can see the level of private debt. The tendency for America was for it to rise after every crisis and then a crash of some description. That is actually, you see the debt levels rising there while the level of debt's falling. The reason is GDP was falling faster than people were repaying the debt. So that's why you've got this coincidence of rising debt level with falling level of private debt. But for that period, and this is the crucial period of the Great Depression, from 1930 to 33, you had huge level of private sector deleveraging. And that's eliminating money from the economy as well as eliminating debt. A bit of a recovery, and then Roosevelt was persuaded to try to balance the budgets once more. And when that happened, the private sector went back into deleveraging again. And the recovery, huge reduction in the debt, only occurred during the Second World War. So at the end of the Second World War, we then have the debt level being here. If you look at that level, it's the lowest that private debt had been in 60 years. Okay. And you then had a period of rising private debt, a boom, and that's the period, the 70s period I've identifying forward, 70s to 80s. A boom and then a crash in the 1990s.
What happened then?
Pardon?
What happened in the 90s? Is this the Asian crisis?
No, well, the 1970s was the first major financial crisis was 1972 to 74, and there was a huge boom followed by a crash. It's actually most obvious in the Australian data. I'll show you that later. But that little pimple there, yeah, that's a boom and bust, and that's the first time we didn't have an actual. You can see there was a huge increase and then a fall in debt, in credit. A lot of instability across this period, but that volatility in credit was far greater than what had been the norm after the Second World War. So if you look, I'll actually use this mouse here. If you look at that level here is about a 5% of GDP level of the change in debt. And we then had this big spike up to over 12%. And then when that collapsed, that was really the breaking point for the pre-war, for the instability period, the 50s and 60s Minsky spoke about. From that point on, volatility in credit became the rule. And if you look up here and see how the rate of growth of private debt in America was the highest it's been in recorded history. Now, this is all the stuff I can't get the neoclassicals even to look at, because according to their theories, debt doesn't matter. Okay, that's why I took you the exercise yesterday, showing the difference between a model where banks are intermediaries and banks are originators. Because they think, well, they're intermediaries, therefore one balances out the other, doesn't matter, they ignore this completely. When you look at it, they ignore the biggest private debt bubble in the history of American capitalism. And that's why they didn't see the crisis coming, so Minsky did. So a common theme throughout Minsky and Schumpeter, and by the way, another book to read is Schumpeter's Theory of Economic Development. It's only a short book, it's about 300 pages. But that to me is the best explanation of the innovation side of capitalism and the cyclical side and the role of credit in those cycles as well. But what Schumpeter doesn't have, that Minsky does have, is a focus upon the accumulation of debt. So Schumpeter sees these booms and busts and doesn't think about whether the debt's rising or not over time. Minsky sees the booms and busts and says if the debt level's rising, then at some point that's going to cause a crisis out of both the level of debt and its rate of change, which is what we saw. So here again is Schumpeter seeing credit as being the creation of purchasing power for the entrepreneur. Credit creates new purchasing power that didn't exist. Again, he's seeing banks as lending to entrepreneurs, which they don't do. They lend to speculators these days. They should lend to entrepreneurs. That'd be a useful force of useful purpose for creating money. But that is then, the vision he has is correct, that additional demand stimulates the economy into a boom, enables new goods to be produced, and then when those new goods come on stream, they undercut the previous goods in the classic creative destruction and cause a slump. So booms and slumps again are a natural part of Schumpeter's vision, and Schumpeter was Minsky's PhD thesis supervisor. So Minsky starts with this whole idea of again, as I've quoted beforehand, take an economy with the cyclical past that is now doing well. So when I decided to do my PhD in the late 80s, I started doing it in 1993, actually in 1992. I thought, okay, I'll take a cyclical model of capitalism and I'll add debt to it. And my favourite cyclical model was by Richard Goodwyn. Anybody heard of Richard Goodwyn before? Didn't think so. Okay, take his name down. Goodwyn was the first economist to really build models of complex dynamics in economics. And he's a polymath. He was a brilliant painter, as well as a mathematical modeler. Not a very good writer, unfortunately. He's not easy to read. He writes poorly. But he was influenced by Marx as well, and he combined Marx and mathematics together because there's a remarkable verbal model of a cyclical economy in Marx in Volume 1 of Capital, completely out of place. It doesn't really fit in the overall structure of Capital, but it's there. And Goodwyn decided to model that verbally, turn the verbal model into a mathematical model. I decided to use his model as a basis for modelling Minsky. So this is in Marx in Volume 1, Chapter 25, Section 1 of Capital. And he says, accumulation slackens because of the rise in the price of labour, because the stimulus of gain is blunted. In other words, the increase in cost of wages reduces profits. The rate of accumulation lessens, and with its lessening, the primary cause of that lessening vanishes. What he's saying there is, because you're investing less, the level of economic activity falls, unemployment rises, and therefore workers will start accepting wage cuts. So the mechanism of capitalism removes the obstacles it temporarily creates. The price of labour falls again to the level corresponding with the needs of the self-expansion of capital. And notice this, whether the level be below, the same as, or above. So he's not talking about it falling back to a subsistence level. Much more sophisticated than that. And he finally says, to put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is the independent, the causal variable. The rate of wage is the dependent, not the independent variable. Now, Marx then spent most of his post-capital drafting period trying to learn calculus. There's a whole set of books called the Mathematical Manuscripts of Karl Marx. And he never quite got his head around it properly. He understood the mathematics, but he tried to put it into too Hegelian a framework. But we believe he was trying to put this model in mathematical form. If he'd done so, he would have predated mathematicians by 50 years, because it wasn't until the late 1910s that mathematicians modelled the process that Marx is talking about here. So what Goodwyn did was, working what mathematicians had subsequently done in the 1910s, they'd built models of the interaction of predators and prey in a dynamic system. And the reason for this was that I think Locke was the biologist and Voltaire the mathematician, but one or the other had noticed the substantial change in the ratio of fish to sharks in the catches that fishermen were bringing back during the First World War. So the biologist noticed these strange cycles, and he approached a mathematician. I think it was Voltaire as the mathematician. I hope I've got that right. And Voltaire said, I'll try to model the dynamics for you. So the idea was that in the absence of sharks, fish populations would grow exponentially. In the absence of fish, shark populations would fall, exponential decay. With the two together, the rate of growth of fish was positive minus a numerical factor times how many sharks there are. For the sharks, the rate of growth of sharks was negative plus a positive factor times how many fish there are, and out of that you got a cycle. Okay? So with that vision, Goodwyn said, well, I can put the same thing together for capitalism. So the level of capital stock determines output. Output determines employment. Employment determines the rate of change of wages, and that's essential. It's got a differential equation turning up there. Output minus wages gives you profit. You assumed all profit was invested. Investment is the rate of change of capital. You've closed your model. Okay, you don't need to have this anchor in the future. It's a complete model just in that particular statement. So if you look at it this way, it's saying capital gives you output, gives you labour, gives you rate of change of wages, gives you profit, gives you investment, gives you rate of change of capital. And to spell it out slightly more completely, If you have a capital output ratio, so you use V as your capital output ratio, that's going to give you output. Divide by labour productivity, you're going to have a workers you hire. Divide workers hired by population, you get the employment rate. Feed that into a Phillips curve for the rate of change of wages as a function of the employment rate. Okay? That's going to give you output minus wages, which is going to equal to profit. And if all profit is invested, that's the rate of change of capital. You've got a complete dynamic model there.